So welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm particularly excited tonight for this talk by a dear and esteemed colleague, Emily O'Brien, whom I'll introduce in just a few moments. But before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is being beamed out from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and I'm currently on Musqueam territory. Just a couple of announcements about upcoming events, and actually just mention that we had the fourth installment of our pandemic talks last night on policing the pandemic. We have the final one, which would be about the challenges and opportunities presented to the left by the pandemic. So I think that's going to be really exciting. And I'd just like to acknowledge Derek O'Keefe's hard work in putting the series together. And obviously there's a close tie-in between that series and the talk this evening by Emily. The two aren't formally linked, but there's such a thematic overlap. I'm very pleased about that. And on another note, I'm very happy to have colleagues come and talk about their expertise or talk from their expertise about their work and how it relates to the challenges that we're currently facing. So without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Emily. Emily O'Brien is an associate professor in the History and Humanities department at SFU. Her research focuses on the intersection of politics and intellectual culture in the 15th century Italy, and in particular in the Renaissance papacy. She's published several articles and essays on the writings of Pope Pius II and a monograph entitled The Commentaries of Pope Pius II, and the Crisis of the 15th Century Papacy, and that's published by University of Toronto Press in 2015. Her current book project focuses on civic consciousness and the reception of Cicero's De Officii in Renaissance Italy. Please join me in welcoming Emily O'Brien. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you very much, Samir. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everyone who is here who I can't see. Delighted you made time for this talk tonight. I'm going to share my screen now. You are looking at 3 manuscripts from Renaissance Italy. One is a collection of letters, another is a work of history, and the last is a miniature from a collection of short stories. These manuscripts date to the 14th and 15th centuries. They are Italian in origin. They are a product of a period known as the Renaissance, a period that in Italy is usually framed as lasting for about 250 years, from approximately 1300 to 1550. And it is one distinguished by the revival of the intellectual and artistic culture of Greek and Roman antiquity. These texts are the work of humanists, thinkers and writers trained in what today we would call the humanities. And indeed, they are the ancestors of their works are the ancestors of the humanities curriculum today. You might also see these texts as works of art, and they are indeed studied as such. People who illuminated them, miniaturists, were artists in their own right. And because of the big price tag of these books, not just the gold leaf, but the vellum on which they were written, the materials with which they were bound, we can look at these manuscripts also as commodities and as impressive advertisements of their owners' wealth and social status and intellectual pedigree. But by the end of this talk, I want you to see something still more in these 3 texts. I want you to see them as bottles of medicine, as life preservers, as first aid kits. And I want you to see in their humanist authors an identity that we do not usually associate with poets, storytellers, and historians. First responders. It's startling to hear this language, I realize, and it may seem like a cheap attention-grabbing stunt, but it's not. It's actually an accurate representation of the purpose these texts served in the age in which they were written. In my talk today, I will work to explain why we can and should think of these humanists and their writings as first responders. To do that, I'm going to take you into the 14th and 15th centuries to illustrate how these writings emerged in response to a particular set of circumstances, a particular set of crises. But I'm also going to explain why we should care. I'm convinced that there is something very important, very practical, and very timely that we can learn from this Renaissance world about the humanities and about the role they should play in the historical moment in which we find ourselves today. The reflections that I will present here are ones that I have been thinking about for many years now. But the unexpected arrival of COVID-19 helped me to bring these ideas into sharper focus. It has also filled me with a sense of urgency to wrestle with them, to want to share them, even though I know I am still working through them. So I think of my talk today as a work in progress. I'm deeply grateful that I've had the opportunity to do some of that wrestling with my colleagues and especially with my students. My classroom these past few semesters has become a laboratory for exploring some of these ideas, and my students have been the ones doing many of the experiments. I have learned from them and from their work a great deal. I am very grateful to Samir, to the Institute, and to its staff for giving me the opportunity to test out these ideas on an audience. Dialogue has been so important to developing them and so central to the humanist enterprise, and I look forward to continuing that conversation. I thought I'd begin by telling you more about the intellectual movement that produced these texts and so many others, and by showing you how this intellectual movement relates to the humanities as we know it today. The Renaissance Italian world that produced the artistic revolutionaries of Giotto and Michelangelo, of Leonardo and Raphael, also was home to an intellectual and educational revolution. That revolution has come to be known as humanism. Its adherents, humanists. And to learn about it is to learn the origin story of the humanities as we know them today. Humanism began as a countercultural movement directed against traditional medieval education that was focused on training people, and by here I mean training men, in medicine, law, and theology. Humanists proposed a course of study that focused on an entirely different set of disciplines and with a decidedly human focus. Their aim was to explore and understand the human condition, human potential, how human society did and should work. Those disciplines were history, poetry, moral philosophy, which meant the study of how to be a virtuous person, a good citizen, and a good ruler, oratory, the art of public speaking and debate, and grammar, the mastery of good classical Latin. Together, these 5 disciplines formed the Studia Humanitatis, the humanities. The last of these disciplines, grammar, the study of good classical Latin, signals what lay at the foundation of this new curriculum, the writings of ancient Greece and Rome. It is from that primarily, though not exclusive, focus on antiquity that we get our word Renaissance or rebirth. And the humanists, the Renaissance or rebirth, the humanists, those trained in this course of study and who taught it, sought to bring this ancient culture back to life, as that word suggests. The term is certainly a fitting one on many levels for what humanists did. They enacted a rebirth quite literally by resurrecting hundreds of ancient works, sometimes Indiana Jones style, by book hunting in the dark and dank libraries of monasteries in Germany and Italy. Their discoveries included letters of Cicero and Quintilian's instruction on oratory that in complete form had been lost for centuries. Humanists also worked to revive the older and what they saw as the truer, purer, and better Latin of classical antiquity, rejecting the medieval Latin language, which they deemed corrupted in the centuries after the Roman Empire had fallen in the West. Humanists also reintroduced, brought back to life, long neglected genres like the dialogue. But in truth, the Renaissance was much more than an intellectual rebirth. The humanist enterprise was as much a pedagogical reorientation as much as it was a textual and stylistic revival. It involved new ways of reading, full texts as opposed to short selections, a new historical sensibility, a new appreciation for how language was a living, changing organism. Humanist engagement with antiquity was also fundamentally a creative one. The revival was not a replication of antiquity, but a reimagination of it, an adaptation. And humanists weren't shy about saying that it was also often an improvement on what had come before. Finally, as I've already suggested, humanism was a form of rebellion, especially in its earliest decades, against the priorities of the medieval curriculum. The earliest beginnings of humanism have been traced back to the 13th century, but as a movement and one that would give rise to this new educational program, a new kind of schooling for both young boys and university students, it began in the 14th century and with someone by the name of Francesco Petrarca, also known as Petrarch. We're going to get to know him a little better shortly. With his rich and rare library, his vast network of contacts, he shared through his writings, and especially through his letters, his conviction about the power of the humanities, his sharp criticisms of medieval education. He won a following that within a few generations would forge his ideas into the Studia Humanitatis, this new program of study, that while not entirely replacing the traditional medieval curriculum, gained enormous influence alongside it. It is easy to see these humanists, as I've sketched them here, as history nerds, bookworms, obsessive, inward-looking antiquarians. And when I try to explain the work that I do as an intellectual historian of the Renaissance, I sometimes struggle to dispel those images and associations. Somehow the beauty of the manuscripts themselves adds to the idea that humanists were out of touch, that they were learned snobs. And so, of course, does the fact that they wrote in a language that our contemporary world has pronounced dead, even though at the time it was anything but. Not that this image is completely inaccurate, mind you. Certainly they were an elite group, these humanists. Their education was tailored to the ruling class, one almost exclusively of men. Obsessive about their books, they certainly were, and many of them celebrated learning as a way to enrich their contemplative life. They were happy to keep to their studies. Some of them, not all of them. But they were never fully disengaged from the world around them. To understand the significance of this movement, why humanists appeared on the scene in the first place, and within a few generations gained such influence and prominence, to appreciate what this movement contributed to society, we need to climb back into that world. We'll start in the 14th century, a period that you may have learned something about over the last 15 or so months because we share something in common, a pandemic. In 1347, the Black Death, whose mortality rates were astronomically higher than they are for COVID-19, began arriving on the shores of Italy in the ships of Italy's great and prosperous merchants. The disease ravaged its cities and countryside, as it did throughout Europe and parts of Asia, wiping out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, and all the while upending and unraveling society in ways large and small, and with repercussions that lasted for centuries. But the plague was only one of a series of interlocking crises that engulfed 14th century Italy and that spilled into the 15th. And my focus here is on Italy because that's where humanism emerged, but these crises largely affected Europe as well. The disease was preceded in the early 1300s by dramatic climate change, a drop in temperatures that earned the period the name the Little Ice Age. And that, together with years of relentless rains, devastated agriculture and especially grain production. Consequence was widespread famine on a scale unseen for generations. During this same period, Italy was ravaged by near chronic war and political violence, a product in part of the fact that the peninsula was at the time a patchwork of small states, the republics of Venice and Florence, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States with the Pope as their prince, and many smaller ones, as you see here on this map. As these states jockeyed for power and territory, they suffered upheaval and instability internally. Cities, the epicenters of these states, saw struggles between the landed aristocracy and merchants, and between both those groups and the working classes. They were riven by deep-seated factionalism, scarred by vendettas and mob violence. Their neighborhoods felt more like war zones. These cities, or Italy, suffered as well from the wars raging elsewhere. The 100 Years' War led to the collapse of Italy's two major banks, who had underwritten most of the campaigns. And as all of this was happening, there was a breakdown underway at the highest levels of leadership in the Catholic Church. This at a time when Europe was better understood as Western Christendom, thanks to the power and influence of both Christianity and the institution of the Church. In the early 14th century, the papacy had been uprooted from Italy and moved here to Avignon in southern France, where it was mired in corruption, or at least rumors thereof. The Pope's interests shifted increasingly to administrative tasks, especially that of fine-tuning a massive apparatus for tax collection. Petrarch, one of our humanists, referred to this as the Babylonian captivity, a label he borrowed from the Bible and that he conferred with deep shame. The papacy's return to Rome in the 1370s, 70 years later, was swiftly followed by another crisis, a period of 4 decades where there were 2 rival popes, one in Rome, the other back in Avignon, and a brief period where there were 3. The end to this great schism came in the early 15th century through the crowning of a single pope. But while it resolved the acute crisis of authority, it had not come to terms with the fact that the Church, and not just the Pope and his cardinals, were desperately in need of a massive program of reform. That crowning of a single pope, orchestrated by the Holy Roman Emperor and done by an assembly known as a church council, created a new and dangerous threat to the papacy, a new conception of ecclesiastical government, in which the church was no longer directed solely by a sovereign pontiff. Italy, torn apart by its rivalries, its wars, and other challenges, was also faced with yet another daunting challenge as the 15th century wore on. And so were the princes of Europe, or Christendom. The Ottoman Turks in 1453 stunned the West by conquering Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and in their sights was a very vulnerable Europe. These centuries together formed an age that was truly defined by crisis: political, economic, and social, demographic and humanitarian, ecclesiastical, and spiritual. This was the world from which the humanists first emerged, and in which the humanities curriculum first took root. The timing was no accident. The humanists and the humanities emerged as a response to a world in crisis. The impetus for this new intellectual movement, humanism, and what sustained its momentum, what propelled it into educational preeminence, was precisely the concatenation, the cascade of crises through which these humanists were living. Many of them saw themselves very much responding to this upheaval. It was what gave them purpose. It was what got them jobs. And in the texts of antiquity and poetry, grammar, oratory, and history, and moral philosophy, they believed they had found critical instruments and medications to heal society and individuals within it who had been fractured by these crises. Instruments in medicine to staunch their wounds and to restore them to health. Humanists and the humanities, thus, were the first responders of these Renaissance crises. I want to introduce you to a few of them so that we can get a closer look at what I mean, at just what that first responding looked like. And we'll start with someone you've already met, Petrarch, often called the father of humanism for the role he played in developing, spreading the word about the value of antiquity and its relevance to his own world. I've already identified Petrarch's letters as profoundly important for getting the movement of humanism off the ground. And it is also these letters that are so important for us to get a sense at how humanists and the humanities served as first responders. Petrarch lived through the horrors of the Black Death, and he wrote extensively about his reaction. His letters show us how shell-shocked he was by the experience, especially by the trauma of losing his friends. They were dying in droves, suddenly, unexpectedly, horribly. And in what he writes, you can feel the wounds are raw. I will quote now a passage from a letter that Petrarch wrote to one of his dearest friends, Louis Heiligen, in the summer of 1349. A friend, significantly, he named Socrates. He nicknamed him Socrates. Scarcely a year and a half have passed since I returned to Italy and left you weeping on the banks of the Sorgue. So I'm not asking you to cast your mind back a long way, but to count up those few days and consider what we were and what we are. Where are our dear friends now? Where are the beloved faces? Where are the affectionate words, the relaxed and enjoyable conversations? What lightning bolt devoured them? What earthquake toppled them? What tempest drowned them? What abyss swallowed them? There was a crowd of us. Now we are almost alone. We should make new friends. But how? When the human race is almost wiped out? And why? When it looks to me as if the end of the world is at hand? Why pretend? We are alone indeed. Many of Petrarch's letters, as well as his other writings, are imprinted with this profound awareness of his own frailty, his own mortality, and also with an equally deep appreciation for human friendship, how vital it was to his being, how much of himself he had lost when his friends were gone. It is in the context of this loss that he writes a series of letters to ancient figures, 10 in total, a few predate the plague, including Livy, the great Roman historian, Cicero, the great orator, Quintilian, the ancient Roman master of rhetoric, and Homer, whose epic poems Petrarch longed to read but couldn't because he knew no Greek. What is he doing writing to dead people, you might well ask? Well, there are a host of different reasons. For example, in his letter to Homer, he discusses issues of a literary sort, talking about translation and literary imitation. But there's something more going on there too. He writes to these figures as if they are very much alive, as if they should and will write back to him. He opens himself up to them, telling them of his disappointments and frustrations, his joys and curiosity. We should make new friends, Petrarch had written to his friend Heiligen. But how, when the human race is almost wiped out? Homer, Cicero, Livy, Quintilian were, in some sense, Petrarch's new friends. In fact, in his letter to Homer, he explicitly refers to him as his long longed for friend. Petrarch's letters to him and to other ancients connect him with a new community, and at the very time when his own was disappearing terrifyingly before his very eyes. This idea is only further confirmed by the fact when he compiled his letters in his letter collection, the Familiares, the letters to his friends, Petrarch included these letters to the ancients in the final section. I think it also helps us to remember that the letter I quoted earlier, and here on the screen, in which Petrarch writes about the debilitating effects of the plague, he wrote to a friend that he had nicknamed Socrates. Thus, in forging these connections, we should see Petrarch doing something more than just literary, something more than intellectually profitable. Read in the context of his other letters about the trauma of the plague, these ones show him tending to his mental and emotional health. His communion with these ancient authors, as with his other friends, was restorative. And whether to the dead or to the living, the very act of letter writing, a quintessentially humanist activity that Petrarch had consciously modeled on Cicero, whose letters to his friends he had personally unearthed, was for Petrarch a lifeline through the pandemic. And he was not alone here in finding solace in times of crisis by connecting with the dead. And I'm going to take this opportunity to jump ahead a few centuries to someone that you may know a little bit more than Petrarch, Machiavelli, who exiled from Florence, and that was very much a personal and professional crisis for the political animal that he was. In that exile, he wrote a letter to his friend about what he did after he would spend his days in the countryside with people with whom he had nothing in common. He would retire to his study and greet another community. When evening comes, I return to my home and I go into my study. And on the threshold, I take off my everyday clothes, which are covered with mud and mire, and I put on regal and curial robes. And dressed in a more appropriate manner, I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men and am welcomed by them kindly. And there I taste the food that alone is mine, and for which I am born. And they, in their humanity, answer me. And for 4 hours, I feel no boredom. I dismiss every affliction. I no longer feel poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. I become completely part of them. Machiavelli puts into words, I think, what Petrarch was feeling, and his language is telling here. I dismiss every affliction. I no longer feel poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. The Humanities were Machiavelli's life raft. They rescued him, as they did Petrarch. We're going to head back now to the 14th century to talk about another of Petrarch's friends, a celebrated humanist in his own right, and one of the most remarkable texts of the Renaissance, the Decameron. And the humanist who wrote it is Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of 100 stories between 1349 and 1352. They were the years immediately following the Black Death, which had swept through his native city of Florence in 1348, and it swept away a staggering number of Florentines, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population, estimated at about 100,000. The plague is the setting not for the stories themselves, but of the storytelling. Boccaccio begins his book in Florence as the plague is raging, and with a group of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, whom you see in the picture here. Like many of their station, they were a well-off group. They left Florence together. They set themselves up in a villa not far away in the countryside, and over the course of 10 days, they take turns telling stories, 10 each day, with particular themes, though sometimes those themes are open-ended. The tales they recount cover the spectrum, from fairy tale romance to heart-wrenching tragedy, from stinging social satire to a raucous send-up of the Roman Catholic Church, and from sex and violence to slapstick and witty repartee. Boccaccio's tales are shocking, entertaining, engaging, and profoundly human. They are also, not surprisingly, a perennial favorite of my students, so I have resolved to work them into every single course I teach. Each story offers a fascinating window onto many aspects of Renaissance Italy, including the one I'd like to focus on here, how humanities and the humanists function as first responders, here too in the context of the plague. The Decameron is best known for the introduction, the first-hand account that Boccaccio provides of the plague's immediate and devastating effects on Florence. But the text as a whole, Boccaccio very much acts as a first responder to the catastrophe he lays out in the opening. It is too big of a topic to take on in full, so I will focus on just a few ways that he does this. And I'll start by looking at the very first line of the book in his preface. To show compassion to people in distress is a human quality which every man and woman should possess. Boccaccio goes on to say that in writing the Decameron, he is doing just that. I intend to offer solace, he writes. Thus, from the opening pages of the book, we are told to approach it as a form of aid to those sending out an SOS. He says more particularly that he wants to bring solace to ladies suffering in love, but scholars agree that he understood his audience to be much larger. And I think his message even broader. Particularly helpful in this regard is what he goes on to say in the introduction as he talks about the plague sweeping through the city. Again and again, he emphasizes the lack of compassion that he sees as family members abandon one another in the face of the disease, the everyone for themselves attitude. If people had only treated one another better, he says, he bemoans. For Boccaccio, the plague infected almost everyone, some with the bacterium, but others with indifference, callousness, and selfishness, attitudes that proved lethal in their own ways. Does the Decameron itself show compassion for these people too? Does it offer them a kind of first aid, those who suffered from the plague? I think we can see that simply in his subject matter. Through stories, he spirits his audience away, taking them far from the despair in which they were engulfed, and into a comforting structure of the storytellers' lives, their daily rhythms, and their rituals. The compassion also emerges in how he narrates the stories as well. They are filled with people confronting obstacles, suffering various kinds of distress, sometimes trivial, sometimes life-threatening. Often these messes are the fault of those who are in them, and because they have transgressed social norms. Boccaccio does not judge them. Not the young nuns who are forced into convent life, who give in to their desire for their handsome gardener. He does not judge the young widow who snuck her lover through a tunnel into her bedroom. He models his empathy consistently. And I think he provides comfort and aid in other ways as well. Most of the stories in the Decameron are about change, not the destructive changes ushered in by the Black Death. The plague makes no appearance at all in his stories. But the changes are similar in that they dismantle and upend many of the same social structures that are being fractured by the plague, many of the same institutions. So the bonds of family, the patriarchal structure of society, marriage, the clergy as authorities. In the stories his storytellers craft, They effectively reorder and reassemble the building blocks of society, its traditions and ideals and practices. We meet servants outsmarting their masters, women taking charge of their sexual freedom in a way that was absolutely unacceptable in that age, outwitting their husbands, speaking out against the patriarchal structures in words and actions, and even taking on roles of lawyers and merchants. Again, not what they would have done. Boccaccio's stories take catastrophe as an opportunity to rethink and re-examine how their world was structured. Destruction becomes a doorway through which creative and constructive forces emerge. To be sure, the stories have plenty of characters buffeted about by fortune, powerless in the face of change, but at the same time, he underscores how we ourselves can effect change if we are thoughtful and resourceful and willing to take some chances, as so many in his stories do. Without exception, Boccaccio's stories shine a spotlight on the characters who think on their feet, who adapt to fast-changing situations, who respond creatively to these challenges, who keep their cool and defy the odds, often by escaping their predicaments deftly and with remarkable good humor. There are happy endings. And these are the characters you find yourself and the endings you find yourself cheering for. The stories in the Decameron are powerful celebrations of resilience and intelligence, prefaced as they are with a graphic account of the Black Death's toll on Florence, and recounted as they are by people who themselves are trapped by the pandemic. These stories carry a powerful message that rebuilding can happen, that reordering will work out. The Decameron, in other words, seems to be answering the urgent SOS of the day, of those who had survived the plague. And that reading is confirmed, it seems, by the fact that after they have completed their 100 stories, the 7 women and 3 men leave the countryside. They head back to Florence, as if they too, through their stories, had been fortified and strengthened, as if they had also received a kind of first aid. My last example of a humanist as first responder is one that takes me into a very familiar territory. The book that I have written about this topic is about Pope Pius II, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who reigned from 1458 to 1464. I have studied Pope Pius II at length, in fact, at book length, as Samir told you at the beginning of today's lecture. And specifically, I have explored how this text here, his commentaries, a history of his own papacy and his own life, represents a response to the crisis that the 15th century papacy found itself in, and that enveloped him and his pontificate. It was a complex crisis for him, in part because before he became pope, he himself had advocated the different kind of government that knocked the pope off that position of sovereign rule. His papacy as well had not gone as planned, a series of embarrassments and failures in how he ruled his papal states, combated the challenging model of papal government, and his disappointing efforts to lead a crusade. When he began writing his commentaries, the story of his papacy, these threats were ones that were real. Increasingly, his own legacy, he must have realized, would go up in flames. So where did he turn to douse those flames? His pen, and more specifically, history, by writing a history of his own pontificate. In my book, I take apart how he does that by harnessing antiquity, Virgil and Julius Caesar in particular, in creative and clever ways, so as to present an image of untarnished success and glory. Pius emerges as a man who merges both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope in a single person, who successfully forges peace with the rulers of Christendom and unites them on a crusade that only he is capable of leading. his work effectively obscures the reality of his pontificate, one that was really a string of disappointments, a string of failures. In my work on this, my sustained analysis of his work in the context of his crises has led me to appreciate how meticulously he attended to these details of revision, how he worked to erase and distract all of the small and big details that challenged the image he sought to create. It confirmed for me the extent to which he saw his situation as a conflagration, and the extent to which he saw history as playing a critical role in putting out that fire. Pius died after he had completed 12 books and begun the 13th of his great commentaries. And while the work was not life-giving to him, it was to the institution and especially to his own legacy. To this day, many still read this text as fact, including the spellbinding account of the conclave, in which he single-handedly convinced most cardinals that he was the best available candidate to be pope by his magical powers of oratory. There are so many other examples that I could talk to you about here. For instance, about how humanists in Florence enlisted ancient history and poetry and mythology to break down factionalism and forge a sense of unity and civic consciousness in their city. I could explain how they used the newly revived genre of dialogue to speak truth to power in Medici Florence, or how they mined the writings of Cicero and Seneca in an effort to ground a new generation of leaders in civic virtue. I could talk about how humanists appeal to ancient philosophers as models for working through problems constructively, how to engage in respectful debate, how to seek and find compromise, how to remain open to changing your mind. Humanities' relationship to politics and to the complex crises that plagued the political world in the Renaissance is one of the richest and most important areas of study. It is where my own research lies. But instead of wading into this topic, I'll leave you with one brief example. King Alfonso of Naples, one of the most powerful princes in the 15th century and one of the most accomplished generals. According to the humanist Antonio Beccadelli, better known as Panormita, Alfonso so admired Julius Caesar's military skill that he would consult his works, the history of the Gallic War and the history of the Civil War, daily while he was on campaign. Panormita tells us that Alfonso brought Caesar's commentaries with him on every expedition. He never missed a day when he would read them very carefully, Panormita writes, and praise both their elegant style and their practical knowledge about waging war. Now, if there was ever an example of how learning history was a life-saving endeavor, this is it. The idea that humanists and the Studia Humanitatis, the humanities, responded to contemporary crises is not something that I've come up with on my own. It is ingrained in archival documents, in works of literature and history of the period, and also in the art and architecture of the age. The idea is woven in turn into decades of scholarship and has been returned to prominence in a recent study by one of the foremost historians on Renaissance intellectual history, James Hankins. In his magisterial work, Virtue Politics, humanists, he says, turn to antiquity as a way to respond to the moral crises plaguing the government and beyond. As Hankins writes, there is much more still to understand about the connection between these crises of the 14th and 15th century and humanism. Clearly, from a scholarly perspective, this is a topic that deserves additional attention. But I would add that it must be explored for reasons other than historical scholarship. Why? Why should audiences care? Care more specifically about how I framed that connection here, the idea that humanists were first responders. Why should this general audience, and I'm speaking directly to you, why should you care now? Because in this story lies a particularly compelling answer for the question that hangs over the humanities today. Why do they matter? It is also, I think, an impetus for all of those who are already confident with the answers to those questions. An impetus for advocating more vocally for the importance of the humanities right now and more than ever. The study of English literature and history and languages today is seen as anything but vital and life-saving. In some cases, it is seen even as an obstruction to life, insofar as life is livelihood. It is read as a kind of entertainment, self-indulgent, maybe even downright irresponsible, since so often people do not see its usefulness. But if we are mindful of how the first students and teachers of the humanities served as first responders, how they envisioned themselves in that role, I think we can begin to erase the misconceptions that try to close the door on the humanistic disciplines and their value. We replace those misconceptions with a vision of the humanities' irrefutable relevance, their fundamentally practical essence. And by practical, I want to be clear, I'm not trying to reduce a humanities education to professional training. Practical in the sense that Petrarch and Boccaccio would have understood as personal and spiritual, as well as professional. And for crises that were related both to the community and to the individual. We can show that the humanities at their root are in their very essence the applied humanities, because that's how they were originally conceived. A university like Simon Fraser that proudly proclaims that it is engaging the world should be saying loudly and proudly that this is precisely what the humanities are and have always been about. Indeed, what gave the intellectual movement of humanism its traction, what catapulted it into a position of preeminence, was precisely its public engagement. Humanists, as first responders, this idea is something necessary now for us to contemplate and act upon, because the conditions that we find ourselves in at this moment are ones not unlike those the humanists responded to with such versatility and creativity and success. I don't want to make facile connections here. I don't think it's productive to draw straight lines between our crises and theirs. But the parallels are undeniable. A society that we are living in turned upside down by a plague, political factionalism that has unraveled into deadly violence. On the chilling day that the US Capitol was stormed, I was reading a document about how a mob in Florence had stormed the seat of the city's government, the Palazzo della Signoria. It was very real and very raw for me. Those parallels in our circumstances demand our attention. Why? Because it was these conditions, all too familiar now to us, which first propelled the humanities to the forefront, that created the space for disciplines like history and literature and oratory to challenge and rewrite traditional systems of education because of what they were seen to offer the world at the moment. If the humanities originally took shape as a way to equip people to respond to and combat crises, including a pandemic, then what should we in 2021 be doing? We should be training a new generation of humanist firefighters and doctors and paramedics. In short, the role that humanists played in the context of their own crises serves as irrefutable evidence of the enormous potential of the humanities education today, right now. It serves as an urgent reminder that we need people trained in the humanities to help face down our own crises. This is where we are now. This is what we need now. This is why we need the humanities now more than ever. By studying the Renaissance beginnings of the humanities, we also have more than just compelling arguments at hand. We find a powerful vocabulary with which we can talk about and advocate for the humanities. And I think this is especially important because so often when people ask about why study the humanities, we fall back on these cliches or these references to you become a good critical thinker. The problem is not that these aren't true, but that they are stale and vague and abstract, and they don't fire anybody up, me included. What did Petrarch tell us? Bemoaning the medieval educational curriculum, Aristotle teaches what virtue is, I do not deny it, but his lesson lacks the words that sting and set afire, an urge toward love of virtue and hatred of vice. Mine is not so lofty a goal as Aristotle or Petrarch, that of spurring people to reject vice and embrace virtue. But there's something I think that I and we can take from what Petrarch says and apply to our own task. And that's why in my terminology of humanists as first responders, I take a page from Petrarch's book. I am being provocative, but more importantly, I want to be thought-provoking. And I also hope I am being responsible as a historian. The interpretations I've put forward come from my long process of thinking about, reflecting on what the humanists themselves have said. And while they themselves didn't literally use the term first responders, I tried to make the case that idea can be discerned and argued. I'll just add that in their writings, there are explicit equations between the humanists and the medical worlds. For example, in one of Pope Pius's friends' letters to him, writing when Pius was sick, the friend tells him that he is sending him poetry as medicine to help him feel well again. Another humanist, Leon Battista Alberti, has a still more arresting image in his dream vision, the Fatum et Fortuna. Here, the liberal arts are likened to planks that we cling to while being swept away on a fast-moving river. Humanities as life preserver. This was not my idea, it was Alberti's. So why isn't that on an advertisement for a humanities degree? I asked myself when I read it and scribbled it down. In other words, who better to turn to listen to when defending the humanities than the humanists themselves, who defended this study so ardently and eloquently, and who did it so effectively because they understood how to harness the power of language. I think of Pope Pius II and how animated he is when he rises to the humanities' defense. It's hard, it's hard not to feel what he's feeling, as I've discovered reading his words that positively leap off the page as he defends letters and fires back against those who dismiss poetry and oratory as a waste of time. Humanists were master communicators. They have brilliant strategies for grabbing your emotions as well as your ideas, your heart as well as your mind. What have we learned from them? Thinking about those lessons, I've learned to smile when someone says something about Latin being a dead language. To me, it is a life-giving language for the humanities today. And I think tapping into these humanist texts can teach us a great deal about how to talk to students and parents and educators and administrators and employers and government leaders about why the humanities matter and matter now. I know that work is already underway, and one of the most exciting examples of that is the project launched just a couple of months ago in the United States called Educating for American Democracy. It is a big and bold initiative of 300 educators from Ivy League professors down to kindergarten teachers, together with their students, who have joined together to rethink how history and civics are taught. The project is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and by the US Department of Education. Why are they doing this and why now? Because of what they are calling a crisis of democracy and of civic understanding. A crisis illustrated, they say, by the fact that people don't understand how their government works, why it does what it does, and how they as citizens fit into the picture. Their question is simple. If the citizens of America don't know about their own country, how will they be able to lead it in the future? I hear in their words those of Petrarch, words he wrote in 1341 as he wandered through the city of Rome, run down, emptied out, and abandoned by the papacy, a shell of its former self. For today, who were more ignorant about Roman affairs than Roman citizens? Sadly, do I say nowhere is Rome less known than Rome. For who can doubt that Rome would rise again instantly if she began to know herself? Closer to home, I am proud to be part of two departments, history and humanities, that are deeply committed to making their teaching and their research speak to current problems facing the world. My colleagues are doing fantastic work, and I would be eager to hear you share what you are doing and see in the conversation that follows if you see yourself as a first responder. And of course, the Institute of the Humanities, where I am so lucky to be able to give this talk, exemplifies this idea so very well. On a much smaller scale, I have my own projects underway in my classroom, and especially in my fourth year seminar class on Renaissance Italy. For the past 2 years, I have had students at the end of that seminar confront head on the question of why we should bother studying the humanities, except I tailor it specifically to my course. Why study Renaissance Italy? Their audience, I say, as they're to answer this question, should be one that is unconvinced or unaware of the value of studying Renaissance Italy. The goal is to make the most powerful pitch they can. The responses I have had to this assignment have been terrific. Students have embraced it with passion and creativity, shaping their answers as newspaper editorials, letters to Joy Johnson, our president here at SFU, podcasts, video presentations, high school lesson plans, and image-rich PowerPoints. They have written with confidence and with conviction. They have broken open cliches about history by zeroing in on specific and compelling examples and by speaking from their own experiences, which, by the way, is exactly what humanists do. Not all of them, but many have zeroed in on the question that we grappled with on and off throughout the seminar discussions. How can studying Renaissance Italy help us to grapple with our own crises today? One student just this semester did a magnificent presentation on Renaissance Italian sculpture and how studying it can equip us to understand and weigh in on controversies today about public statues and whether or not they should be on display. I'm thinking about Confederate generals, for example. Many students made their case by drawing on the extraordinary experience of studying the Black Death while living through a pandemic of their own. Repeatedly, they identified Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron as essential reading in our COVID-19 world. They argued that the text offers strategies for everything from managing fear and uncertainty to navigating the aisles of the grocery store. It helps us make sense of how people behave in a pandemic. It explains why it's okay, even necessary right now, to keep laughing. And it illustrates in myriad ways how crises can translate into creativity and into constructive questioning of society's values and its priorities. Here, my students have had a chance to become humanist first responders themselves. They have applied what they have been learning to make sense of the crises they are living, both local and global, both private and public, and to translate that history into metaphorical medicine and life preservers and fire hoses. I know many of them have found it empowering to articulate the importance of history in these terms. And their excellent work has further convinced me that I'm onto something. As I go forward, I will have much to learn from them, as much to learn from them as I do from the first responder counterparts in Renaissance Italy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. That was a wonderful talk. Would you mind? Yeah, so you've unshared your screen. It was so lovely to be introduced to your friends from the Renaissance and to learn from them. I mean, one of the real delights of teaching in a department like the Humanities department, I acknowledge that you're part-time in history and part-time or half-time in history and half-time in humanities, but it's just wonderful to always have the opportunity to learn from colleagues, and I really did this evening. So I would like to just invite people. I see there's a question up already, but I'd like to invite our participants to place your comments in the question and answer period, question and answer section. And I'll come to the question that's there in just a minute, but I have a question for you, Emily. And I think you've given a really terrific and well-rounded and insightful talk about how Renaissance humanism and its protagonists are first responders to the crisis of the Black Death. And you're also hinting as well throughout the talk about the way in which the humanities is in its own kind of crisis. So it responds to a crisis, but it's also in this ongoing crisis. And it has been for a long time. It's not just recently, but it does seem that the pandemic has placed universities in a difficult position, and it's let's say made the precarity of the humanistic disciplines, the liberal arts, much more pronounced. And I just have one example that's just come up in the last couple of days, and that is that Aston University in Birmingham has decided that it will no longer be teaching history. And I've got a quote here, and I think it's quite revealing. I don't actually have the quote here, but the government basically says that student success is not well served by the teaching of history, right? Meaning they won't be able to get jobs, which in and of itself is highly contestable. But this is the thinking of governments like that of Boris Johnson, the Conservative government in the United Kingdom. And we see this in many different places, many different jurisdictions. So there's this crisis, in a sense, the neoliberal crisis. But just referring to your mentioning the public art and statues and so on that have become such a flashpoint over the past, let's say 4 years since the election of Trump, but especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's part of a larger, and I think quite necessary discussion about the need to decolonize our institutions, particularly in this country, and indigenize. And there's also, a kind of claim that our universities, our institutions are too Eurocentric. So there's a need to address this, which does, in a sense, place pressure on the humanities, especially on the humanities that has such a historical orientation to humanism in the Renaissance sense. One can understand humanities in a broader way. My position on this is it seems like the baby tends to get thrown out with the bathwater here. But I'd be interested to know how you approach this question. It's something that we're all, in a sense, dealing with. What would your response to that claim be? That we need to make the teaching within humanities, within the university more generally, less Eurocentric and more, let's say, attuned to decolonial approaches?
Well, I think that when I advocate the importance of the humanities, I'm not saying that we should adopt their curriculum specifically, in the sense that the humanities as we know it today has evolved and has embraced a far wider collection of sources and authors and ideas than what they found valuable themselves. There's plenty of space and plenty of need, and I think they would entirely agree that there is room to adapt and to expand. So I would not say that we should take my talk at all as a cheerleading for Eurocentrism, but rather for these disciplines of the humanities, which can absolutely and must include Indigenous literature, humanities as they are expressed and articulated all over the world, because that is the world we need to speak to.
Yeah.
And so I think that that as long as that is made loud and clear, not that I don't think antiquity and Greece and Rome and Latin even should be, I don't think they should be pushed aside, but I absolutely want the table to be bigger and more people to be sitting at it.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I think we're already trying to move in that direction insofar as we're reinventing ourselves as the Department of Global Humanities.
Exactly.
And this is important, where we bring more people to the table, rather than say we just need a completely different table. I think those are two different things. And I was thinking while you were talking about Machiavelli, and in the context of the pandemic now, in specific terms of this important binary in the Prince, and that is the binary between virtue and fortuna, right? Yeah. And Hannah Pitkin, this political theorist who taught for many years at UC Berkeley, has a book called Fortune is a Woman. And Machiavelli, she draws out the way in which Machiavelli thinks of fortune, the kind of historical contingencies that public figures have to deal with all the time, as a kind of feminine force. And this, it's a very sort of masculine notion of virtue, which enables particular, historical figures to master those contingencies. So a kind of a male force mastering and dominating a female force.
Absolutely.
And you say, well, oh boy, this gets us into all kinds of problems, doesn't it? But one can also say that the male and the female are positions. They're not specifically tied to gender roles or indeed sex. And today, for example, we could say that the figures who have really done well in the pandemic, who really embody this ability to master contingencies and lead well, have been female, right? And I know in our province, Bonnie Henry is a bit of a controversial figure, but by and large, it seems like she's done quite a decent job. The Prime Minister of New Zealand similarly has done a very good job, where it's the very male figures, the kind of patriarchal figures like Bolsonaro and Trump. Boris Johnson has sort of righted the boat somewhat, but at the beginning, he really dropped the ball. These figures have been terrible. They've had very little, virtue, right? They've been mastered by contingency rather than mastering them. So we might be able to, in a sense, work with these concepts in a more nuanced way, right?
Absolutely. And I think if we did that, we would once again be following in the tracks of the humanists, because their idea of how to interact with and make the most of their ancient sources was to be creative and to be innovative. And so I think so often of Petrarch's wonderful image that he uses to describe imitation. If you're going to use a classical text, what do? You are like a bee who takes the nectar and turns it into honey. And so we should approach the humanists, their education, their writings with that same idea. We don't just cut and paste. We do something nuanced. We do something that makes sense for us. And I think that translation of virtu to women in our day is an excellent example, and one that, as I say, falls in line beautifully with their own methodologies.
Well, it was a virtuosic talk, so I had to, raise it. Okay, enough of me. I'm going to get on to the questions. So, a question from Deborah Rurak, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, is as follows. I understand the line you are drawing from Petrarch and Boccaccio to humanism and first responders, first responses, but can you elaborate more on why Machiavelli and Pope Pius II?
Sure. So why they are first responders? In the context of Machiavelli, the way that I talked about him specifically was more about how he was benefiting from the sort of the first aid of the humanities, rather than himself being a first responder. So the texts, the ancient authors that he was communing with, were the ones who were tending to his own needs, his own crisis, as he was cast aside in exile and unable to participate in that political community that he wanted to. And he was alone and felt it very much. You can absolutely, however, see him as a quintessential first responder when he was writing that letter about putting on his robes and talking to Livy. He was in the process of writing The Prince. And both that text and his discourses that he wrote as well show him taking the learning from especially the ancient historian Livy and finding in it the answers to the problems, especially of Florence, but of Italy at large. Italy, which had been invaded by European powers to the north, Florence, that was in another sort of wave of great political crisis. So he saw history and Roman history and Republican history, especially, as an answer to as a way to solve those problems and bring medicine to those wounds. Pius II is someone who I interpreted here for you as being a different kind of first responder, in the sense that I saw him experiencing and seeing the institutional church as essentially being on fire. And by writing a work of history that presents it as strong as the rightful leader of religious and also sort of secular authorities, and presenting his own papacy as one that is immensely successful, he is able to essentially stop that crisis on one level by creating a legacy, by creating a story that he hopes will actually obliterate the reality. And it did for many, many years. So in that way, he is responding to the crisis of the church, and history is putting out those flames.
Thank you, Emily. I'm just going to come now to David Murhady, who's the chair of our department and an exemplary humanist in his own right, is a classicist. Before I read out his question, though, I'd just like to acknowledge that there seems to be a number of students in the audience. Great to see you here. And I do encourage you to ask the question if you like. It'd be really nice to hear from you. We are nearing the end of the 90-minute block that we had, but we can certainly go beyond that. There's no problem with that. If that's fine with you, Emily, to stick around a bit. So David Murhady's question is, Tacitus declares that he, unlike others, writes his account sine ira e studio, that is, dispassionately, and I would say in a disengaged way. Many of your authors talk about their humanistic studies likewise as a refuge from their daily lives. Can these views be reconciled with an engaged university? Good question.
I'm trying to understand exactly what you're suggesting, that we have to be engaged. We have to be passionate in order to be engaged. I think I'm missing what you're saying.
David, do you want to elaborate on that? I think he's pointing to a certain contradiction here, isn't he? That the thinkers that you are drawing upon are actually, in a sense, retreating from engagement. I think that's what he's saying. Yet you're making the case that they can be drawn upon to engage the world, that humanities is naturally, invested in public engagement.
Right. I think that there are some humanists who see, who absolutely did see their studies as a retreat and as a way to get away from, especially the political fray. And I think Petrarch was very much one of those. But at the same time, he was someone who used his pen to call out the corruption and of the church, and the fact that things had been so drastically derailed by its leadership, and also somebody who recognized that being engaged with the humanities was something that could be done and should be done on a personal level, and that was something that should be valued, and that the university, I think he would say, should value as well. If for no other reason than it prepares us to be able to engage in the world. There was a spectrum of responses to antiquity, and certainly my talk has made this equation very clearly, but not everybody and not all the time did they see themselves doing this kind of response to crisis. There are many other ways in which their writings and their way of connecting with antiquity and these disciplines served their needs and gave them fulfillment. But I don't think that humanists would see it as a contradiction to find refuge and find solace in reading Boccaccio, and because at the same time they could go out and write that dialogue or write that treatise that asked people to think about why their leader was their leader. So they could do both at the same time.
But maybe it was a contradiction, but a productive one, right? I mean, the letter you quote from Machiavelli of him sort of dressing up in his finery and communing with the ancients was what enabled him to write The Prince, which was then attempted entree back into public life. So exactly. I don't know that it's such a problem. Yeah. Tammy Thies, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly. My apologies in advance if not. What advice would the humanists of antiquity have for someone who works in healthcare communications today to instill hope and impart a feeling of civic duty, particularly around getting immunized? What an important question. Thank you, Tammy.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. One of the things that I'd suggested that my students do, nobody took me up on it. I realized it was extremely challenging, is to take what they learned from the humanists and to draw up an advertisement or a public health message about getting an immunization. And so I wanted to see that happen, and I'm hoping that down the road we will get something. I will get something like that as an assignment. I can draw your attention to somebody who has, in some way responded to a similar question, not about immunizations, but certainly about speaking to those in healthcare. On the side of the hospital in Bergamo, Italy, there is a mural that is painted of a healthcare worker masked, cradling in their arms Italy, the peninsula, and it is a very powerful image that I think brings to bear what the humanists talk about: the power of concrete imagery, the power of speaking compassionately here in a language of art rather than of words. And I see that as a magnificent example of how to connect with, to use the humanities, here the arts, as a way to respond to the devastating responsibilities and challenges that they face on an hourly basis. So that's one example that springs to mind. I think reading and writing, people have been, for example, in this pandemic, writing new versions of Boccaccio's Decameron. I think that solace that comes from that and from connecting through letters is clearly something that the humanists would recommend as very real and with great promise to bring healing. So those are tools that they would offer.
Thanks, Emily. Now a question from Jennifer Martin. So interesting. Thank you. Storytelling groups across Canada have been revisiting the Decameron over the past few months. Okay. Can you say a bit more about the enduring appeal of this work? Who were the original readers? Can you say how the work of the humanities during the current plague will be remembered? That's an interesting question.
Ooh, yeah. Gosh, I wish I knew the answer to the last one. I think it's up to us what we do. What we do with what we have, and certainly there's so many models for how we can respond productively and constructively and compassionately through the humanities. So what is the enduring appeal of Boccaccio's Decameron? I wish I had my students here to talk, because they have articulated that so well. I think it is fundamentally, it's human. The people in these stories are very familiar. They're very accessible. They even though they belong to a world that in many ways is totally foreign to us, they experience the same kinds of tragedies and unexpected turns of fortune, and they get in trouble the same way, and they laugh about the same things. And I think the stories they transcend that distance, and reading them will be the key to seeing exactly how that works. He is a gifted storyteller like no other. But I think also the appeal, certainly for me as a teacher, I have not written about Boccaccio in my own scholarship, is that there's so much room to think, and so many ways to read it. And some people will read a story and say, that is so misogynistic, and others will say, what a champion of women, and a debate ensues. And you never you're never at a loss for finding something in Boccaccio to talk about and to debate. And he leaves open questions and is subtle in the messages that he's sending. And that can become so engaging, as it has been for my students. His audience was one that extended well beyond the humanist audience who knew classical Latin, because he wrote in Italian. He wrote the Decameron in Italian, and he wrote at a time when the Italian language was still needing to sort of communicate and defend itself as a legitimate literary language. So he sought an audience that would go beyond the learned humanist community. The stories were circulated sometimes individually, sometimes told orally, and so they did have a wider readership than the manuscript I showed you might suggest.
Thank you, Emily. Now, a question from another of our colleagues, Alessandra Capodoni. Thanks for a great and inspiring talk, Emily. I wonder if you could comment on the inherent interdisciplinarity as well as multidisciplinarity of Renaissance humanists and how it informs a shift in the view of the world. Also, second question with regard to the plague, I'm always struck by the way in which the writings you mentioned are charged with affect and the flesh. Do you think they establish a new genre of crisis writing if compared to, I think it's Thucydides? For example, they speak more to the blending of emotion and thought.
These are terrific questions, and I, as someone who doesn't have enough experience with the genre of or crisis writings, and I know Alessandra does very much. I'm not really in a position to say if it is a new genre. It would certainly be worth trying to bring together, certainly in the case of the plague, the range of responses, the many different genres in which they appear, and to explore the questions that you are thinking of. Thucydides, and there were other sources as well. I know that Boccaccio, for example, used as he was writing the Decameron and writing his description of the plague, and yet he did not, copy and paste. He was doing what good humanists do, and adapting and being mindful of his own situation. So I think absolutely it is. It's an intriguing question, and one that is, a hypothesis that you're making here of something new, especially on the lines of emotions, is one that makes a great deal of sense. But I would hold off saying anything more definitive until I had a chance to explore and talk to you further, which I hope certainly to do. You also talked about the interdisciplinarity of and the multidisciplinary of Renaissance humanists, and how it informs their shift in the view of the world. That's a huge question. Wow. Well, I think I think what they were hoping to get at with this this selection of disciplines was as full of a picture as possible of human beings, and you can't get that solely from the kind of history that was written in antiquity or that they were hoping to write today. You get a piece of it from poetry and from rhetoric and so on. So I think that what it allowed for is a chance to answer those critical questions that they had going in, which is how do we be? What are we all about as human beings? What makes us tick? What are the ways we can put our society back together or better in a new way? And what is our potential for growth? What are our weaknesses and our limitations? And I think that they certainly would have said they had a much, much better understanding of how to answer those questions by moving away from the very strict and much more siloed disciplines in the medieval curriculum. And so studying this breadth would have allowed them for that more full dimension of humanity.
Right. I think we have time for just a couple more questions, and then we should bring it to a close. Here's, I think, a really fascinating question that gets really to the heart of so many things. This is from Sean Miller. The humanities represent a particular curiosity, a willingness to challenge the status quo. In the age of COVID, it seems that institutional authority has become popularized again, admittedly for a good reason. A difference between the Renaissance and our own time, I wonder about it, is perhaps the public space allotted for the humanities. As an SFU history grad myself, I do not for a second doubt the validity of the humanities, but I do find it concerning that the realm of criticism is itself relegated. While I'm unsure how popularized humanism was amongst the public during the Renaissance, I find it concerning how in our current era, we must justify our area of thought. As humanists, as critical thinkers, how can we challenge? I think this is the gist of it. So this is really the gist of the question. As humanists, as critical thinkers, how can we challenge institutional authority at a time when the public relies upon it to resolve the COVID crisis? I mean, this is really tricky, isn't it? This is a tricky question. We need to be skeptical of of constituted authority of the state, but at the same time, our skepticism could be at the cost of undermining public health protocols, for example. So how do we approach that?
That's a terrific question, and a very well articulated one, which no doubt has to do with the fact that you are a history grad.
Exactly.
It's one I would like to mull over at much greater length. But one thing that springs to mind right away is something that you, Sean, would have learned and had much practice with in getting your history degree, and that was absolutely the tool of all tools in the humanist toolbox, and that is how to have a dialogue, how to have a debate, which they very much looked back to Plato to find their models for, where you could have a reasonable discussion, where you could both, you could put forward criticism in a way that was constructive and that would be listened to, and in a space where people went in with the idea that they can move in their positions and that they should be open to that on principle. And those were the ground rules. And to me, this is the most, one of the most important things that we should learn, that everybody in government needs to learn, and that is how to bring that back and how to make that the engine that allows us to deal with the very kinds of issues that you're suggesting. How do you thread that needle so you don't try to upend the government, but you do offer a critique that will be accepted precisely because of the way that it is delivered and the understanding of what purpose it serves. So that is, for me, that's one of the reasons why I put such an emphasis in my teaching on class discussion, on participation, on getting comfortable with that process, and on allowing for these kinds of debates and discussions to happen so that they can be translated into a world where it gets very tricky and there's a lot at stake. So that's just one possible way of handling it. And Samir, I know this is something that you must be thinking about a lot too. So I would love to know what you would say.
I do think about it a lot, and I would say this. I mean, draw upon another Renaissance figure, and that would be Galileo, and the fact that Galileo was really the originator of the scientific method. And so we say that, well, while knowledge and power are intertwined, they're not the same thing. They're not the same. So politics and science aren't the same thing. Politics makes incursions onto science in various ways. Corporate power and interest in the form of pharmaceutical companies do as well. But there is a method that is extricable from those entanglements, right? And I think that some of the discussion about the Eurocentric nature of the university and the need for decolonization and so on assumes a too close a relationship between power and knowledge. And I think this is perhaps, in a sense, the influence, not such a great influence, of Michel Foucault and before him Nietzsche, on epistemology. So I think we need to untangle those two things. And also I'd say that one thing that maybe the questioner is getting at is something that's happening, and that is that there is a skepticism that's extremely healthy and necessary to all spheres of life, in particular politics and science. Science formalizes skepticism, right? It makes skepticism part of its own enterprise. Mm-hmm. What Karl Popper says, that this back and forth between conjecture and refutation, right? The constant attempt to falsify scientific findings and so on. This is the engine that drives science. The problem seems to be when that skepticism is taken out and affects science as a whole. So it's no longer being used within it, but rather to undermine science. And that's really dangerous. So I think we might need to make some important sort of distinctions here. in this way. So, but it requires a lot more time and discussion. But I think what you're suggesting, Emily, too, discussion, critical debate, and so on are necessary. But again, much more difficult to do today, right? For all kinds of reasons. So thank you very much. Thanks again for the question. It's such an important one today. I think we can just end on a final question, just about some suggestions on where to go. I mean, this is a good way to end. Homework, what would be, texts where, okay, the question really is, could you comment more on Petrarch and where those of us who are unfamiliar with his works should focus? I think this is a good way to end the session.
Okay, so comment more on Petrarch. How much time do I have? Petrarch is has voluminous writings. He was incredibly prolific. Much of it is accessible in English, including letters, volumes of his letters, which are a wonderful way to appreciate what he is trying to do with this humanistic enterprise that he is conceiving of. And they are beautifully written and with humor and a sharp tongue and all sorts of things that will bring him to life the way he brought to life others from the ancient world. The great news about those, and also about so many other humanist writers, is that there has been in the last 20 years, I think it's been, a new set of volumes called the Itati Renaissance Library, which is the Renaissance version of the Loeb editions for ancient Greek and ancient Latin, where you have the original language on one page and then you have the English translation on the others. So humanist writings are the topic of the Itati Renaissance Library, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of volumes where you can get a taste of Petrarch and Boccaccio and so many other humanist writers, the famous ones as well as those lesser known ones. And I highly recommend that you look for them. Very easy to access on the Harvard Press website, and very well sort of described and introduced to people who are not familiar at all with this field and the authors. So that is a wonderful way in, and I would recommend that. I'd also recommend that you buy Boccaccio, which will be excellent summer reading and beyond. If anyone has not, anyone who really wants to delve in a way that is, an easy pathway in, these stories are the place to start.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Emily. What a wonderful talk and great responses to our questions. I'd like to thank the audience for coming and for staying till the end, and for your wonderful questions and comments. They're really terrific and really challenging. But thank you also to Devin Gillen, who's here as one of the panelists. He is our videographer and he's recording the event and will do the post-production to make it look so nice, as he always does. And of course, as always, to Huyen Pham, who is the program assistant at the Institute. Program assistant doesn't quite do justice as a title to the enormous amount of work that she does and the kind of responsibilities she has at the Institute. So I always I'm always thankful of Huyen. I sometimes forget to thank her, and that's not good. So thanks again, Emily. It was great to see you. Great to hear you. I've put the notice up, as you can see in the chat, for our event next Wednesday. Please come by. I think it'll be a really interesting, provocative discussion. And again, very much in this line, what do the humanities have to say to these fundamental questions of our age? So hopefully we'll see you then, and wish everybody a lovely evening. Good night. Bye.